Will you go to your execution with a clean heart? With yes. Knowing that feeling you'd have done nothing wrong. Yes. February 24th, 2000, Huntsville, Texas. 6:18 p.m., Betty Lou Beets lay strapped to a bed, waiting to die. At 62 years old, she had 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. She looked like any other grandmother you might see at a grocery store or a church picnic. But Betty wasn't there for being a loving grandmother. She was about to become only the second woman executed in Texas since the death penalty came back. The state was killing her for murder. Cold-blooded, planned murder. When the prison boss asked if she had any last words, Betty stayed silent. No apologies, no explanations. She just smiled at her lawyer and pastor, then closed her eyes. 2 coughs, 1 sharp breath, then nothing. But here's what makes this story so scary. Betty didn't kill once. She didn't kill twice. Over 20 years, husband after husband disappeared or ended up shot. Some survived. Others weren't so lucky. The woman who looked like everyone's sweet grandmother had turned her own backyard into a graveyard. She buried 2 husbands right outside her kitchen window. One in a decorative wishing well, another under the garage. For years, she fooled everyone. Police, neighbors, even her own family. She collected life insurance money. She cashed pension checks. She played the grieving widow perfectly while her victims rotted in shallow graves just steps from her front door. But how does a woman who couldn't hear well from North Carolina become one of the most famous widows in American history? How did she get away with it for so long? And what finally brought her down? To understand how Betty Lou Beets became a killer, we need to go back to a hot summer night in 1983, to a quiet house by Cedar Creek Lake, to the moment she looked her 5th husband in the eye and decided he had to die. What happened next shocked even experienced investigators. This is the final sentence. Stay with us because the truth behind Betty's final hours is scarier than anyone could imagine. Please like this video, share, and subscribe to support our drive to get you this information that's almost going extinct. Cedar Creek Lake, Henderson County, Texas. A quiet Saturday evening in the middle of nowhere. Betty Lou Beets sat in her small home with 2 men. Her 5th husband, Jimmy Dunn Beets, relaxed in his favorite chair. Her son, Robert Branson, visited like he did most weekends. The house felt peaceful, quiet, perfect for what Betty had planned. At some point during the evening, Betty pulled Robert aside. She looked him straight in the eye and said something that would haunt him forever. "I'm done with Jimmy. I can't do this anymore." Robert thought she meant divorce. He was wrong. "Jimmy has to die tonight," she said calmly. No emotion, no tears, just a simple statement like she was talking about taking out the trash. Then she told Robert to leave. No explanation, just go. Robert walked out the front door and drove away. He didn't ask questions. He didn't call the police. He just left his stepfather alone with his mother. Inside the house, Jimmy Dunn had no idea what was coming. The 46-year-old Dallas firefighter dozed in his chair, tired from a long week. The TV flickered in the corner, casting shadows across the room. Betty walked into the living room carrying a gun. Jimmy never saw it coming. She raised the gun and fired twice. Both bullets hit him in the head. He died instantly, falling forward in the chair that had become his deathbed. Betty stood there for a moment, watching. No panic, no regret, just cold planning. 2 hours later, Robert returned home. He found his mother waiting calmly in the kitchen. Jimmy's body still sat in the chair, blood pooling beneath him. "Help me get rid of the body," Betty said, and Robert did. Together, they carried Jimmy's body to the front yard. There sat a decorative wishing well that Jimmy and Robert had built together just months earlier. It wasn't a real well. just a brick-lined hole meant to look pretty in the garden. Now, it would become Jimmy's grave. They lowered his body into the well, wrapped him carefully, and sealed the bricks. Then they poured concrete over the top. When they finished, the well looked exactly like it had before. Beautiful, innocent, perfect. But Betty wasn't done. She had to explain Jimmy's disappearance. The next morning, she drove to the boat dock where Jimmy kept his fishing boat. She crushed up his heart medicine and scattered the powder across the deck. Robert removed the boat's propeller to make it look like machine failure. Then they pushed the boat into Cedar Creek Lake and let it drift away. Later that day, Betty called the police. Her husband had gone fishing and never came home, she said. She sounded worried, scared, like any loving wife would be. The boat washed ashore on August 12th near Redwood Beach Marina. Inside, police found Jimmy's fishing license and the scattered medicine. They believed Betty's story completely. For 3 weeks, rescue crews dragged the lake. Divers searched the cloudy water. Helicopters circled overhead. Firefighters from Dallas joined the search for their missing friend. They found nothing. During the entire search, Betty played her part perfectly. She stayed home, acting like a sad widow. When the fire department chaplain visited to comfort her, she didn't ask about the search. Instead, she asked about Jimmy's life insurance, his pension benefits, how much money she would get. The chaplain found this strange, but Betty had an answer for everything. She was just being practical, she said, planning for her future as a widow. Nobody knew that Jimmy's body lay buried just 50 feet from where they sat talking. The perfect crime. Or so Betty thought. But to understand how Betty became a killer, we need to look at her past. Because Jimmy Don Beets wasn't her first victim. He was just the last one anyone would find. Betty Lou Donovan was born on March 12, 1937, in Roxborough, North Carolina. Her childhood was a nightmare from the start. When she was young, Betty caught measles. The disease left her mostly deaf for the rest of her life. But according to Betty, the real damage came from her father. She later said he sexually abused her, though she never reported it until after her murder trial. When Betty turned 12, her mother was sent to a mental hospital. Betty suddenly became the parent. She had to raise her younger sister and brother while still being a child herself. Her childhood was over. At just 15 years old, Betty married her first husband, Robert Franklin Branson. She was still a teenager when she started having children. Over the next 17 years, she had 6 kids with Robert. But their marriage was chaos. They broke up and got back together over and over again. Finally, they divorced in 1969. That's when Betty's real pattern began. She married 6 different men in total. One of them, Bill Lane, she married twice. And according to Betty, most of these men abused her. But she only made these claims after she was already on death row for murder. Her second husband was Bill Lane. Betty shot him twice. Once in the stomach, once in the back. Bill survived both shootings and even said he had threatened to kill her first. Betty never got in trouble for shooting Bill. In fact, she remarried him shortly after putting 2 bullets in him. They divorced again within a month. Her criminal record kept growing. Public lewdness charges, gun violations, a reputation for losing her temper and getting violent. But Betty still wasn't done with Bill Lane. In 1978, she tried to run over her third husband, Ronnie Threlkeld, with her car. He survived, too. Both Bill and Ronnie would later speak against Betty at her murder trial. The pattern was clear. Betty married men, things went bad, and violence followed. But her husbands kept surviving until they didn't. In 1981, Betty's 4th husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, disappeared. One day he was there, the next day he was gone. Betty told people that Doyle had left her. Since he had a criminal record and moved around a lot, nobody questioned it. no missing person report was ever filed. Betty kept living in the same house where Doyle had vanished. She acted like nothing had happened. Life went on, but Doyle hadn't left Betty. He was buried in her backyard the whole time. When police finally searched Betty's property in 1985, they found Doyle's remains under the garage. He had been shot with the same gun that killed Jimmy Don. Betty was never formally charged with Doyle's murder, but prosecutors used his death to show the jury a pattern. Betty didn't just kill Jimmy for insurance money. She had been killing husbands for years. The evidence painted a scary picture. Betty would marry men, often older men, with money or benefits. When she got tired of them, or when she wanted their insurance money, they would disappear. Some, like Bill Lane and Ronnie Threld, were lucky. They survived her attacks and lived to tell about it. Others like Doyle, Wayne Barker, and Jimmy Lou Beets weren't so fortunate. They ended up buried in Betty's yard like garbage. For over 20 years, Betty perfected her system. Marry, kill, collect, repeat. She played the role of the sad widow perfectly. She knew exactly what to say to police, how to act sad, how to make people feel sorry for her. But by 1983, Betty had gotten sloppy. Or maybe she just got too confident. When she killed Jimmy Lou Beets, she made mistakes, and those mistakes would finally bring her down. The question wasn't whether Betty was a killer. The question was how many victims she really had. And investigators were about to find out. For nearly 2 years, Betty Lou Beets thought she had gotten away with murder. Jimmy Don was officially listed as a drowning victim. The case was closed. Betty was free. But in the spring of 1985, everything changed. An anonymous tip came into the Henderson County Sheriff's Office. Someone called with information about Jimmy Lou Beets' death. The caller said Jimmy hadn't drowned in Cedar Creek Lake. He had been murdered, and Betty Lou Beets was the killer. The tip was too detailed to ignore. It had specific information that only someone close to the crime would know. Investigators decided to take another look at Jimmy's disappearance. On June 8, 1985, deputies arrested Betty at her home. They also got permission to search the property where she had lived with Jimmy. Betty watched from a police car as investigators began digging up her yard. She stayed calm, just like she had during Jimmy's disappearance, but this time her act wouldn't work. In the front yard, investigators found the decorative wishing well. It looked innocent enough, just a pretty garden decoration made of bricks and concrete. But when they broke through the concrete, they found something horrible. Human remains. A body that had been shot twice in the head. The victim had been carefully wrapped and buried like trash. It was Jimmy Lou Beets, but the investigators weren't done digging. Behind the house, under an old garage, they made another terrible discovery. More human remains badly rotted from years in the ground. This body belonged to Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty's fourth husband, who had disappeared in 1981. Just like Jimmy, Doyle had been shot in the head. The killer had used the same weapon for both murders. Investigators found that weapon too. Betty owned a gun. Tests proved it was the gun that killed both men. The evidence was overwhelming, but prosecutors needed more than just bodies and a gun. They needed to prove Betty was the killer. That's when her son, Robert Branson, came forward. Robert told investigators the whole truth. How his mother had told him she was going to kill Jimmy. How she had sent him away that night. How he had helped bury the body in the wishing well. Robert's words were devastating. He described his mother as cold and calculating, a woman who killed for money and felt no guilt. And money was exactly what Betty had gained from Jimmy's death. Investigators discovered that Jimmy had $110,000 in life. Insurance through his job as a Dallas firefighter. Betty was the person who would get it. She was also supposed to get $1,200 per month in pension benefits. Without a body, there would have been a 7-year waiting period. But Betty was patient. She was willing to wait for the money. The reason was clear. Betty had killed Jimmy for his insurance and pension. She had killed Doyle for similar reasons. Betty Lou Beets wasn't just a murderer. She was a black widow who killed her husbands for money. The evidence was rock solid. 2 bodies, the murder weapon, eyewitness words from her own son, and a clear money reason. Betty's perfect crime had finally fallen apart. On July 11, 1985, Betty Lou Beets walked into the 173rd District Court of Henderson County, Texas. She was 48 years old and facing the death penalty for murdering her husband. Betty said she was not guilty. Her defense plan was shocking. Instead of saying self-defense or abuse, Betty's lawyers tried to blame her own children for the murders. They suggested that maybe her son Robert or one of her other kids had killed Jimmy and Doyle. Not Betty. It was a desperate move that would backfire completely. The prosecution's case was strong. They had the bodies. They had the murder weapon. They had the reason. But their most powerful witness was Betty's own son. Robert Branson took the stand and destroyed his mother's defense. He told the jury exactly what happened on August 6, 1983, how Betty had looked him in the eye and said Jimmy had to die, how she had sent him away so she could commit murder, how he had returned to find Jimmy's body in the chair. Robert described helping his mother bury Jimmy in the wishing well. He explained how they had faked the fishing accident to fool police. Most damaging of all, Robert called his mother a very selfish woman who cared only about money. The jury believed every word. Betty's defense fell apart. Her own son had testified that she was a cold-blooded killer who planned Jimmy's murder ahead of time. On October 11, 1985, the jury found Betty Lou Beets guilty of murder for payment. 3 days later, on October 14th, they sentenced her to death. Betty became Texas death row prisoner number 810. She was sent to the Mountain View Unit, called the Patrick O'Daniel Unit. But Betty wasn't giving up. She immediately began appealing her conviction. Her first appeal actually worked. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned her conviction in 1988. They said insurance and pension benefits didn't count as payment under Texas law. Betty thought she had one. She was wrong. The state asked for a rehearing. This time, the court ruled that Betty's conviction should stand. Insurance money was payment, after all. For the next 10 years, Betty's case bounced through the courts. Appeal after appeal, motion after motion. The U.S. Supreme Court denied her case in 1989. An execution date was set for November 8th, but Betty got a delay. Another execution date, December 6, 1990. Another delay. Betty filed federal petitions. She said her trial was unfair. She said her lawyers were bad. She argued that evidence of abuse should have been presented to the jury. None of it worked. The federal courts denied her appeals. The Court of Appeals kept her conviction. Every legal door slammed shut. By 1999, Betty had run out of options. Her final appeals were denied. On February 24, 2000, her execution date was set. This time, there would be no more delays, no more appeals. After 15 years on death row, Betty Lou Beets was finally going to pay for her crimes. The legal system had spoken. Justice would be served. In Betty's final days, her daughters made one last desperate attempt to save her life. They appeared before the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, holding photographs and crying. The pictures showed a woman with bruises, swollen face, and broken bones. This was their mother, they said. This was proof that Betty had been abused by every man she married. Her daughters begged the board to spare Betty's life. They argued that she was a victim, not a monster, that years of abuse had driven her to kill. The board wasn't convinced. They had heard these claims before, but only after Betty was convicted. During her trial, no evidence of abuse was ever presented. The execution would go ahead as scheduled. On February 24, 2000, Betty was moved to the Huntsville unit. She was given the chance to request a final meal, but she said no. She didn't want anything. When asked if she had any last words, Betty stayed silent. No apologies to Jimmy's family, no reasons for her crimes, no final statement at all. At 6:18 p.m., Betty was strapped to the bed in the death chamber. Jimmy's son, Jaime, sat in the witness room watching the woman who had killed his father. Betty didn't look scared. She didn't cry or beg for mercy. According to Jaime, she had no expression on her face at all. She just lay there calmly, like it was any other day. As the lethal drugs began flowing into her veins, Betty offered a small smile to her attorney and pastor. Then came to coughs and a sharp gasp. At 6:18 p.m., Betty Lou Beets was pronounced dead. She was 62 years old. After her execution, Betty's body was cremated. Her ashes were scattered over her mother's grave, the same mother who had been put in a mental hospital when Betty was just 12 years old. Betty left behind 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. She also left behind 2 confirmed victims and questions about how many others she might have killed. The great-grandmother, who looked so innocent, had finally paid the ultimate price for her crimes. Justice was served, but the scars she left behind would last forever. Betty became only the second woman executed in Texas since the death penalty was brought back. Her case raised difficult questions that still divide people today. Was Betty a victim of abuse who finally snapped? Or was she a calculating killer who used claims of abuse to escape responsibility? Did her traumatic childhood create a monster? Or was she born evil? The death penalty debate continues. Some believe Betty got exactly what she deserved. Others think life in prison would have been enough. What we know for certain is this: 2 men are dead. Families were destroyed. And a woman who could have been anyone's grandmother became one of America's most famous killers. What do you think? Was justice served, or was Betty Lou Beets a victim of her circumstances? Let us know in the comments below. If this story shocked you, make sure to subscribe for more true crime cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Like this video if it opened your eyes to the dark side of human nature, and share it to keep others informed about the criminals who still stay hidden.